This is the
Five Stars
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. What do you guys want to talk about?
Well, I did it, everyone. I did the unthinkable. I assembled my full list for top 20 matches of the year in 2022. Took me forever to actually find the Word document to begin with, and then when I went back and realized that it was an older edition that I had typed up back in like February or March of this year, then I realized, oh crap, this doesn't have any of the updated matches from like the last 8 or 9 months. So I had to go through my phone and find the other list that I had typed up about a week or two ago, and the whole thing was just a complete mess. We'll just leave it at that. But the list is saved, it's updated, and now I'm just going to take some time this weekend while I have the free time to go back and rewatch a lot of those matches again with fresher eyes, especially the ones that I haven't seen in a while. I want to see how they hold up. It's a very weird hodgepodge of matches, as you will come to find out. You're probably going to look at it and think, wait, that match actually happened? Or, well, wait, why is that match on the list, but this one isn't? Well, never fear. I will explain everything in detail when I actually take the time to talk about the list this coming Monday. And since I'm on that subject, I may as well just kind of cover what I'm going to be doing for the Monday special. We're still going to do Retro Raw. I'm planning on sitting down and taking the time to watch that show this weekend, in addition to the other matches on my list that I need to catch up on. That'll probably be my full Christmas day, is just going back in the archives and watching either highlights or full matches again. I know that I have some of the older Dynamites saved on my DVR somewhere. I deliberately went out of my way to save those shows with the matches that I figured would make my list. I can't guarantee that for every single one of them because that's a lot of Dynamite content to be saving in my archives. But like I said, I'm going to go back and watch some of those matches again. Not the full shows. Good Lord Almighty, I'm not watching the full 2-hour shows again. But, at least that way I can do a better job thoroughly explaining why I selected those matches and why they're standouts to me. Won't be for everybody, but whatever. I don't really care. In addition, I'm also going to be covering some of my overall thoughts on wrestling in 2022 and try to provide a concrete, transparent discussion as to what I thought of wrestling as a whole this year. The good, the bad, the ugly, etc. We'll be factoring WWE into that equation as well as AEW. I'll probably touch on the NWA for a bit because we spent a good deal of 2022 covering those power tapings. Looking back in hindsight, I now realize what a waste of time that mostly ended up being. But again, it's something we'll talk about in full detail on Monday. So there will be plenty to discuss. It'll be a long episode for sure, but hopefully you'll stick around and join me in a little fun discussion on the business this year and talk about where we think things are going to go for 2023. Figuring that you guys probably have some free time to yourself as well, and you won't be doing any traveling. I mean, with the road conditions these days anyway, I don't know why anybody would want to be out. At least if you live in areas where it snows a lot. The wind chill in Pittsburgh, PA as of today hit approximately 2 degrees. I'm telling you, man, anybody out there that tells you they like winter, they're lying. I don't buy it for a minute. Either that or they lived in Florida for their entire life. But for today's show, we'll keep with the regular Friday formula. course, if you're watching the channel for the first time, make sure to subscribe, comment, like the show, the full gamut. You can also find the channel on Rumble if you prefer alternate platforms to view your content. We are on both sites on Mondays and Fridays for new podcast material, bringing you the best of both worlds when it comes to wrestling, be it classic or modern. We do both. Been mulling over some ideas for future content on the channel, but still need to take some time to think about whether or not I want to add anything to the channel. I already barely have enough time to watch the stuff that we're already discussing. So if I tack on something else, I'll probably have to cut back on another segment of the show. My inclination is to throw SmackDown in the chopping block, especially if the shows are going to continue down the paths I've been seeing for the last several weeks. At least Dynamite's train wreck level TV gives me something to poke fun at a lot of the time. With WWE, it's always just me contemplating my life by the time it's over, because I'm wise enough to know what I'm getting with that show. The sports entertainment stuff turned me off in the TV product like 8 years ago, and even for the short couple of months we have been reviewing SmackDown again, I'm already starting to regret that decision. But again, I'll keep you posted. I know what I'd love to substitute in that place, but I'll have to make some room for it. But we'll figure out what we want to do there. For now, let's get going with today's show, because I've got a longer episode of Saturday Night NWA on the Superstation to cover. We're back to the 90-minute programs, and they really do a number on you, because there's a lot of ground to cover in that time frame. But we'll start with Dynamite first and get that totally worthless program out of the way. And look, I'm not going to take too long covering this show. I know I say like every goddamn week we do these reviews, but I actually mean it this time. This was the AEW Speed Surf edition for me this week. There were a handful of segments that I watched in full, and I'd say for about 70% of the rest of the show, I either skipped over entirely or just didn't really jot a whole lot down about, mostly because I just really didn't have a whole lot to say about it. I think it's safe to say, when the girls are getting the main event slot for the program, they're phoning it in with this one. Especially with AEW's track record when it comes to women's segments. But we open with Ricky Starks this week, and he's obviously coming off 1 week removed from his AEW World title loss to MJF, figuring he was going to come out at least mildly pissed off about getting screwed over in that title match. So he comes out here and honestly doesn't seem all that bothered by it. He's pretty low-key. Basically just boils the whole thing down to, oh shucks, should have known better, but I learned my lesson. And the next time I get MJF in the ring for the title, I will get my revenge. He wasn't fuming, he wasn't angry, he wasn't coming out spitting and motherfucking the whole thing. Just casually comes down and goes, oh well, guess there's always next time. And just like that, it's on to something new. And boy, did that new come barreling through full force. But before I dive into that, yeah, it would seem that the one-and-done blow-off was the exact direction they were going with this feud, unfortunately. Even if they decide to revisit it down the road, there's no way it's going to have the same impact. Not with the way Tony Khan books, and how easily guys get cooled off because he has no idea how to capitalize on their momentum. By the time they decide to do this rematch down the road, it's going to be too little too late as far as I'm concerned. And if you don't believe me, ask Wardlow. But I'll tell you who's ready to dive in with both feet to try and soak up all of Ricky's momentum. The single biggest cancer to AEW's product in the last 2 years. The guy that knows how to instantly kill somebody's push flatter than a plate full of piss the moment they catch spark. The instant heat killer, Chris Jericho. Y'all knew it was only a matter of time before Jericho tried to latch himself onto the Ricky Starks bandwagon. As soon as the guys started getting over and people started rallying behind him, Jericho took one look at that and said, "That doesn't work for me, brother." Should have fucking saw that coming a mile away. And as soon as Jericho's music hit here, interrupted Starks' promo, I was like, God damn it, I fucking knew it. And it still irritated me to no end. So yeah, out comes the career killer to try and cut Starks' balls out from under him. And he's out there trying to recruit him into the JAS because that's where everybody's career goes to die in AEW. Naturally, Starks declines the offer and starts ripping into Jericho, initially poking fun at him for looking like an inflated air fryer a couple years ago when he was fat and out of shape. Even though he got himself in good shape in the last year or so, he's still surrounding himself with a bunch of lame duck job guys that nobody gives a fuck about. Didn't necessarily phrase it that way, but that's essentially the point he was making. It says that Jericho looks like a single father going through his 5th divorce, which I kind of laughed at. And he eventually challenges Jericho to a match on the January 4th show, which is an historically bad day in wrestling history for anybody that was a TNA fan back in the day. We all talk about how 9/11 is the day we should never forget. We also shouldn't neglect January 4th, because that was also the date that TNA tried to go toe-to-toe with WWE on Monday nights and got napalmed in the ratings for it. It's an infamously bad day for wrestling, what you may call a dreary date. So Ricky Starks challenging Chris Jericho to a TV match for January 4th doesn't really bode well for him right now. In an ideal world, I would love to think that Jericho would actually put Ricky Starks over clean to keep elevating his profile in AEW, giving him a major defining win, which he's going to need if they're going to try and keep him as a strong challenger for the world title next year. But knowing the way Jericho operates in AEW, he'll probably milk that program for 6 to 8 months, beat Ricky Starks more often than not, bury all his momentum, and by the time Starks actually gets his win over Jericho, no one will give a shit. And Starks will be just another guy on the roster like everybody else that Jericho has allegedly done great business with over the last 2 years, only to wind up killing them dead in the process. Eddie Kingston, Bryan Danielson, Claudio, you name it. Christ, he almost did it with fucking MJF 2 years ago. One of the worst things he was ever involved with in AEW was that garbage-ass storyline with Chris Jericho that went on for decades. Somehow he was able to bounce back from it, but the rest of them haven't been so lucky. So I don't like where this is all going, naturally. I'm a skeptic by nature, especially when it comes to anything involving Chris Jericho at this stage, but we'll see if I'm proven wrong in 2 weeks. That'll be the precedent set for what actually transpires in the year 2023. Are we actually going to get something good, or is it just going to be more of the same, with Jericho getting rammed down our throats nonstop for the entire year? And by the way, there were a couple other things that happened in that segment, including Starks getting beaten up by the JAS crew, only to get saved by the fucking 140-pound indie dork that beat Jericho on television last week. Action Andrade, or Action Andre, whatever his name is. Keep that in mind for later in the show, by the way. So that was followed with match 5 in the best of 7 jerk-off session with the school children. It's kind of all I need to really say about it. The less said, the better, quite frankly. There was a minute-long pre-tape with MJF following up on getting run off by Bryan Danielson last week. MJF's only appearance on the entire show, by the way. The AEW World Champion, 7 days removed from his first successful title defense. 1 minute of TV time. But boy howdy, we need another 20 plus minutes of circle jerk trampoline stunts with the cosplay crew. Priorities in AEW. Glad they've got that all sorted out. Oh yeah, and on the subject of good old Action Andrade, or whatever he is, guess what happened to him? Yep. Got a fireball to the face, courtesy of the Jag-Off Asshole Society. Yeah, whatever. With the way Fireball angles go in wrestling these days, I highly expect he'll be back to wrestle in 2 weeks, completely none the worse for wear. Way to bury the new guy, though. Mad props to Jericho for that one. Doing business the WCW way. That's what I like to see. Following that was the Bryan Danielson promo. Originally to be conducted by Renee Young, and much like every AEW interview turns out, Renee's there to ask one or two generic questions, pass the mic off to Danielson, and then just stand there like an idiot while Danielson cuts the rest of the promo. So why Renee needed to be there, I have no idea. But started off by covering the William Regal story, because apparently that's an issue that still hasn't been settled yet. Guy already has one foot in the door for WWE as early as January, I think, and AEW is still bringing his name up on television, trying to rationalize the 857 different ways they wrote him off of television in 3 weeks. And basically the whole thing centered around, what is the future of the Blackpool Combat Club? To which Danielson did everything he could to tiptoe around the subject of having to bring it up and not mention the quiet part out loud. That being that there is no BCC anymore, and it'll probably just fade into the background, much like a lot of things do in AEW. He also plugged his first set of trainers, seeing as how they were in San Antonio for this episode, one of whom was obviously Shawn Michaels, which he name-dropped outright, immediately spawning HBK chants, which was laughable considering when you realize he's employed by WWE, but that's nothing new with AEW. So once he gets over his little sob story about watching Regal in the hospital because of what MJF did to him, calls out Max to fight, and that brings out Ethan Page and Stokely Hathaway instead. And this got incredibly stupid pretty quickly. Started off fine, with Page talking about how even though he made it to the finals of the Eliminator tournament and was one of the last two guys in the Diamond Ring Battle Royal, it's Danielson that's getting the title shot before Page. And then it kind of disseminated into goofy comedy, where they started joking about Stokely's bald head. They kept going back and forth with calling Danielson Vegetable Man. And it went on for about 20 straight minutes. I kept looking at my clock wondering, is this actually going to go anywhere productive? Finally, they set up Page versus Danielson for next week. All that cringe comedy just to set up another match for Ethan Page to do the job. Must be a great paycheck he's collecting, though. I'm sure he's more than happy to be AEW's designated underneath the job guy. As long as he's getting TV time, who cares? Probably paying him a boatload of money, too. Now, admittedly so, I'll be fair. While most of this promo was excruciating and had WWE delivery written all over it, when Stokely called Danielson a raggedy bitch and Taz totally broke character and started cracking up at the desk, I also started laughing. Taz is a rare gem on this show where he'll just randomly have his moments where he just totally stops giving a fuck, and every time it happens, it always gets a pop out of me. By the way, I was thinking about this when Ethan Page came out here with Stokely. You know, obviously I know they're part of that faction with Big Cass, the Gun Boys, and one of the Lees. I think it's Lee Moriarty. Whatever the group's called, I can never remember. I mean, they've been so irrelevant. But I was wondering about this when I saw Ethan come out. Oh, the firm, by the way. It just came to mind. Where's Scorpio Sky at? Better yet, where the fuck did Dan Lambert disappear to? Remember when the American Top Team group was one of the most forced factions on television for like 5 straight months? All of a sudden, everybody in the group disappears except Ethan Page, who is now part of a totally different faction with a different manager. Christ almighty. You try and connect the dots on this show, and all it does is wind up looking like a big-ass scatter chart by the end. But on a more cheerful note, at least Samoa Joe got to wish Wardlow a happy holiday season. How kind of him. Okay, so honest question. If I held a knife to your back and told you to name the FTW champion without looking it up on the internet, would you have been able to figure out it was Hook? I totally forgot about that. I actually had to look up on Wikipedia how he even won that fucking title in the first place. That's how crappy they've done a job featuring this guy on television when he won the damn thing. Y'all remember the angle they shot with him and Ricky Starks where Starks put up the FTW title against Hook in an impromptu TV match, lost the title in short order, and then got his ass laid out by Powerhouse Hobbs in the same segment? Do you remember when they shot that angle? July 27th. It is almost January of 2023. Nearly 6 months ago, Hook won the FTW title on Dynamite, and I had completely forgotten about it until the moment I saw him show up to wrestle a match here. Booker of the Year, people. I'm going to keep running that joke into the ground every chance I get. It's got to be a meme by now with AEW. Just piece together every poor booking job we've seen in the last 3 years and flash up a picture of Tony's face on camera that says Booker of the Year. The jokes write themselves. So what? Next time we see Hook wrestle on television, it'll be July of 2023? Because that's usually how things go whenever dudes wrestle matches on this show. You see him once, you don't see him again for 8 goddamn months. And there was something else that happened here that I completely glossed over. I think Big Cass chokeslammed Jungle Boy into a dumpster somewhere in the parking lot. Cool. Maybe it was padded like it was when the Ass Boys had that match with the Acclaimed. So following that completely stupid angle, they went right into the totally random Jon Moxley-Darius Martin match, which I also skipped over because, well, why in the hell would I watch it? It's Moxley versus Darius Martin. Who gives a fuck? I did watch the FTR Ass Boys match, though. Coming back from break, so I missed the entrances. I don't know if they actually touched it all before the commercial cut, but if they did, I don't think I missed much of anything. And this was one of those feuds that I had been poking fun at recently because when you take into account all of FTR's booking over the last year, coming fresh off that double dog collar match with the Briscoes at the Ring of Honor pay-per-view, now they're back on television less than 2 weeks later getting jobbed out to an underneath comedy team in 9 minutes. And again, that's nothing against Austin and Colton Gunn. They've been very entertaining in their roles on television, but seriously now? FTR are getting beaten flat by an undercard tag team in the middle of a television show in under 10 minutes? I mean, I know the heels cheated and all, but come on now. I mean, the match wasn't bad for the time they got. They kind of played up the story that Cash and Dax were selling the injuries from the pay-per-view match with the Briscoes, so I could at least buy the idea that they were going into the match at under 100%, which accounted for why they were selling so much. Once it got to the part where they started fighting on the floor, though, and all 4 guys were just randomly getting involved, that's about the point where they kind of lost me. They did a spot at the end where Cash took out one of the guns with a dive. Dax had the other in a sharpshooter, which somehow got broken up, only for Cash to make a short comeback and then eat shit after getting wiped out on the guardrail with another dive attempt. And somehow during all that, Dax tried for a pile driver, but his back gave out. I think he got ran into the steps earlier on. Then one of the guns countered the O'Connor roll and then used Dax's tights to steal the pinfall, which did not get a very warm reception from the crowd, as you'd probably come to expect. I mean, like I said, the match was fine for what it was. I don't really think this did a whole lot for the Gun Boys, if I'm being honest. The match kind of felt rushed. It was buried in the middle of the program, got less than 9 minutes. I get the idea of them wanting to elevate Austin and Colton because they are an up-and-coming tag team that could use a rub, but doing it in this manner on free television when it really could have been milked for a better occasion, I mean, I'm just saying. So, I guess now they're going to run with the FTR losing streak story. Because, that's exactly what you'd expect AEW to do with the best fucking tag team in the world, right? You beat them like a drum and then send them on a tailspin because the jealous EVPs can't get over the fact that they suck and aren't on Cash or Dax's level. Sounds about right. And at that point, gotta be honest with you, I pretty much checked out for the rest of the show. Factoring that the main event was a girls' match with Hikaru Shida and Jamie Hayter, if that segment didn't die in the ratings, I'll be shocked. Not that there was much to keep people's interest by that point anyway. I predict somewhere in the ballpark of 700,000 viewers for that final segment. So yeah, that show was a complete waste of time. 1 minute of MJF followed by FTR doing a job to an underneath heel team in 9 minutes. It's about all you need to know about AEW's state of mind headed into 2023. Made even worse by the fact that Jericho is probably going to wind up burying Ricky Starks before all was said and done. Because what else would you expect from an egocentric maniac like that? And I know they have one more episode to close out the year, but I mean, even for a holiday episode, really now? That was the best they had to offer? I know I always like to go back to the running joke of them not knowing how to properly feature 375 talents on a given show effectively, but it is hard to imagine that when you look at a handful of those guys, they couldn't figure out some way to make the show worthwhile. But hey, I look at it this way. It gives me more time to prep for my big Monday special because I got a lot of stuff I need to do beforehand. So maybe I should count my blessings that they phoned it in with this episode. Knew I'd be able to skip out on more of the garbage that I didn't care about. But we say we lighten the mood a little bit. Let's talk about some retro content. We'll go to NWA World Championship Wrestling, December 20th, 1986. And as we approach the Christmas season here in the year 1986, Jim Cornette is all decked out for the occasion. Came out with Big Bubba to open up the program, sporting a full black suit with a glittery gold lapel, handkerchief, and tie. A look that I don't think I have ever seen since and hopefully won't ever have to endure again. He's also still overcoming the voice strain from previous tapings. So while he had a voice, he was still kind of scratchy here. But he really didn't have a whole lot to say beyond plugging the Bunkhouse Stampede and his boys, the Midnights, talking about how they're coming after both sets of tag belts in the NWA, which means that not only are they still targeting Ricky and Robert, but now they've got their sights set on Ronnie Garvin and Barry Windham. And of course, with the big angle coming up soon with Ron Garvin in the Midnights, this will play in heavily with the upcoming TV shows. But that took us to our opening bout, Midnight Express versus Dave Isley and Zane Smith. Two new job guys that we have never seen on the show before. And while we definitely had a lot of fun burying Pat O'Brien on last week's show for having both a shitty body and shitty wrestling ability, I can't even really criticize either of these job guys in that domain. Zane Smith had a pretty bad haircut, but I mean, that's par for the course with most people in the 80s. Most people were still sporting the mullets. Isley at least looked like a wrestler in some capacity. Only thing I probably would have panned him for were the white tights, because that's always a bad choice of color for any kind of trunks. We also still had the dry blood splotches on the ring mat from the Pat O'Brien squash on last week's show. A visual that you can never forget. May have been the actual highlight of the entire year 1986. Typical midnight squash. Bobby and Dennis are great. No real groundbreaking news to report on there. I did like watching Bobby put one of the guys in an abdominal stretch while Corny was poking him with the butt end of his tennis racket. And then Bobby just grabbed his nose and started playing with it. Keep in mind, too, for the entire match, about 90% of the studio audience was pro-Midnights. Some of them tried a Rock and Roll Express chant at one point, but that got quickly shut down. And in one of the funniest finishes I think I've ever seen, Dennis tags in at the very end. And I'm not kidding. This is exactly what happened. He half-assedly wrestled Isley down to the mat. He basically put him in a modified sugar hold so that his shoulders were pinned down. And then Scrappy McGowan just nonchalantly counted the 3. Even Tony was caught off guard by it. He just went, oh, that's it. I can't even say it was an anticlimactic finish. It was just so bizarre. Just Dennis going in there and casually wrestling a guy down to the ring mat to pin him. Like he was jokingly wrestling a 9-year-old kid. So after that, we went back to the booth for an Ivan Koloff promo. And I'll say this before we get into the particulars. I started taking notes on what Ivan was saying here. And as the promo kept going, I started to figure out that Ivan was just going to keep rambling on for God knows how long. So at some point in this promo, I just stopped taking notes and gave up trying to write down everything that happened. Like, no joke, my brain just shut down. Here's everything I wrote down. He talked about seeking Russian justice on nephew Nikita for turning his back on the Russian family. He mentioned something about his training with Vladimir Petrov. Said that Nikita and the Americans may be proud of the decision he's made, but Ivan knows how he's going to respond. And I think it was at that point where someone in the crowd just went, oh, shut up. And that was about the point where I just stopped paying attention because I realized that this promo was never going to end. It may still be going on as we speak. Uncle Ivan may be in Atlanta right now still talking in the studio about nephew Nikita betraying his Russian morals. So as we come back from break, we had Ricky and Robert out for a promo. And since I already took the time to poke fun at Jim Cornette's attire, I want to take a moment to admonish Ricky and Robert for their poor choice of attire for this promo. Not only was Ricky back to sporting his Mickey Mouse sweater, but Robert was wearing gray denim on denim. And not even the kind of gray denim that looks appealing. It looked like prison wear. Like they were getting ready to process him and stick him in the slammer at Rikers. So whoever approved of the Rock and Roll Express's clothing for this segment, thumbs down. Also thumbs down for Robert Gibson speaking. I have no idea what he said. And then Ricky did another one of his Rock and Roll is Here to Stay promos. Said that him and Robert are coming after Manny and Rude for the World Tag Titles. He also sounded like he was overcoming some kind of cold, because his voice was kind of nasally and clogged up here. I mean, it is that time of year when everyone gets sick, so I'm sure these guys were feeling the brunt of it in 1986. Seriously, anybody that says they like winter can eat a dick. Ron Garvin had a match with Vernon Deaton. Literally, here's all I wrote down. Garvin stretched, chopped, and slapped him around for a few minutes. Won with the knockout punch. One of my favorite parts of the entire show, though, and it happened for like a split second during this match. The fans are obviously chanting for Ronnie for the majority of the match. Beat him up, Ronnie, beat him up. Like the whole 9 yards. But there was one moment in the match where it was kind of subdued and quiet in the studio. And one single jagoff in the crowd goes, "Let's go, Vernon." And the funniest part is that it was met with even more complete silence. I laughed so hard at that 5-minute snippet, or that 5-second snippet. I also enjoyed the spot right before the finish where Garvin had Deaton set up like he was going for a sharpshooter, and right when he stepped through, he just let go and decided, nah, fuck it. then he went right to the knockout punch. I'm not sure what his game plan was there, but whatever it was, he thought better of it. So, took a quick break, came back for Garvin and Wyndham at the booth for a promo. Garvin basically talked about how he and Wyndham won the U.S. tag belts, having not teamed together all that long. And it doesn't matter whether the boys are holding singles or tag gold, Ronnie and Barry should be the number one threat to everyone in the locker room. And Barry said that they've been scouting everybody, and whoever decides to step up to challenge them for the titles, they'll put it on the line. Really nothing else to say beyond that. Like I noted last time, I believe Bobby and Stan end up beating Garvin and Wyndham for the belts eventually, but we're still about several months out from that actually happening. Then we had Brad Armstrong versus Brody Chase. First match back for Brad since the TV match with him and Bullet Bob versus Jim Garvin and Bill Dundee a few weeks back. You know, I don't think I've ever mentioned this before. Probably because I usually don't take the time to actually scout the job talent on these studio shows. Brody Chase was not a bad seller. He was not a particularly great wrestler, but he was actually pretty good at selling facials. Even though it was only a showcase for Brad, these guys actually had some decent chemistry with each other there. Brody wasn't bumbling around here like an idiot, having no idea what he was doing. He fed for Brad well, took some decent bumps, did a great job selling when he was getting worked over on the mat. I don't know why I never recognized that until now, but yeah, Brody wasn't half bad. He was certainly better than Pat O'Brien, which I'm never going to live down for as long as I live. Brad went over with the Russian leg sweep pin combo. Then we had the greatest squash of all time. Ole and Arn wrestled Rocky King and George South. And we've covered the story of the Anderson brothers pretty extensively since the Starrcade fallout, how they're pissed off and on a mission to win back tag gold in the NWA since they're the two key players in the Horsemen right now that don't have belts. And you want to know what's even more fun than watching an Ole and Arn squash match? Watching a pissed off Ole and Arn squash match. Particularly Ole. Because when Ole's pissed, he doesn't give two fucks. And when Ole doesn't give two fucks, it usually makes for great television. And it's fantastic because Rocky and George are not just your average standard job guys in the NWA. They've at least got a little bit of credibility to their name, even if they are used as underneath guys for the most part. So when Rocky and South are in there taking over Arn and doing the constant in and out tags, and the people are getting behind them because they're actually believable as undercard guys. And of course, all it does is add fuel to the fire when Ole gets in there and starts taking over again. The stuff where he was tackling George South to the mat and then grabbing at his arm like a goddamn gorilla. God, that was so awesome. And a few minutes later when George tries to stack up Arn in a small package and Ole is in there to break up the fall by diving onto George's back. It's fantastic. And of course it breaks down with all four guys eventually. Ole threw Rocky out onto the concrete where he may or may have not been pronounced dead on the spot. And finally, after that brutal onslaught and working over George's arm for the entirety of the match, the finish is Ole hitting George with a knee drop from the second rope and then tapping him out with an arm wrench. Made even better by Arn laying out Rocky King with a gourd buster after the fact. To which my final note for the segment reads, God, I'm going to miss Ole when they finally kick him out of the group. Because it's coming up very, very soon. I'm also going to miss Ole's fiery heel promos because he and Arn had another great one here. Ole talking about how they want their tag belts back and it doesn't matter who the unlucky duo is that they have to run through to get them back. He also promises that him and Dusty will eventually get the chance to settle the score once and for all whenever he decides to stop cutting tail and running. And Arn kind of recapped the last couple years of his career. Said it was 2 short years ago where Arn came into Crockett Promotions relatively unknown, And in just a 2-year span, Arn made history. He restored honor to the Anderson legacy, and he's a former NWA TV and National Tag Team Champion. He turns his attention to Nikita Koloff, who is already in the ring preparing for his match. Arn says that every day he wakes up without a belt in his hand, it makes him sick to his stomach. And he's at the point now where it's not a matter of shoulds or coulds. He doesn't want to be champion. He has to be champion. And in that one promo alone, Arn Anderson convinced me that he deserved to be a champion more than anybody else in the business in the last 30 years. Never even specifying what belt he wanted. Didn't matter if it was a tag title or a singles title. If Arn didn't have a physical belt to his name, then his career was worthless to him. And I'll tell you this. If you're trying to hard sell people on the importance of what it means to actually be a champion in the business, Arn Anderson isn't a bad guy to adopt your promo inspiration from. Because that guy fucking sold me on it. Still one of the most underappreciated promos in wrestling history is Arn Anderson. What a natural talker that guy was. So then we went to the ring for Nikita Koloff's match. He wrestled Art Pritz. Once again, going back to the spelling of Pritts. This poor guy just couldn't get his bearings straight, could he? Up to and including his own ring name. The match went 1 full minute. Nikita won with the Russian sickle, wherein I think they made a concerted effort to try and follow Nikita during the running stage of the clothesline to try and capture it in real time. All it did was cause motion sickness for me, so I hope they don't try it again. Not to mention the camera totally missed Nikita actually hitting the clothesline because none of the shit was actually captured in the frame. Anyway, then we went back to the booth for a J.J. Dillon, Tully Blanchard promo. JJ out there talking about how the Bunkhouse Stampede events from Baltimore and Philly are done and over with, and how Dusty had won both of the Bunkhouse matches. And while that may all be fun and good, the bottom line is that if Dusty has his sights set on the TV title, he's going to have to regroup, because there's no way he's going to go into that match at 100%. Then Tully did another one of his sly heel promos where he made sure to establish that he's at the top of the food chain, while at the same time putting over the talent and Crockett Promotions as the cream of the crop. I also liked when he put over Nikita as the U.S. champion, although very questionable, because he's still carrying on the storyline from last year where he never quit in the cage match with Magnum TA, thus he should still be the United States champion. Small, subtle story details, and Tully was so good at bringing those up in the right moments on television. He never let anybody forget that he is the rightful U.S. champion because he never said the words, "I quit." 12 months later, and we all still remember it. So that's all there really was to that. Then we came back from break for a Dusty Nikita promo. First, Tony wanted to take the time to cover Ivan's promo from earlier on, and Nikita basically blew that off entirely and said he didn't want to talk about Uncle Ivan right now. He wants to talk about the Four Horsemen. Says that he and Dusty won't be satisfied until they pick off each member of the Horsemen one at a time. He also had a wacky line in here where he mentioned something about Arn's promo, saying that he was lucky Nikita was in the ring and couldn't hear Arn taking shots at him earlier on. Otherwise, he would have walked over and beat his ass at the podium. To which I then asked, so even in the NWA, the ring had invisible walls that prevented guys from running after each other? I also didn't understand what he meant by here, because I'm pretty sure even if the Arn promo was taped before Nikita's match and they weren't physically in the same room at the same time, we could still buy the idea that Nikita would have heard Arn talking to him, even if it took place in another dimension. So I have no idea what he was talking about there. Little faux pas. But he did say that Ric Flair managed to walk out of Philly and Baltimore with the world title, and Nikita won't be happy until he beats Flair and becomes world champion. And then Dusty kind of dialed things up to 100 with a great promo talking about the Horsemen. Told Arn to go check himself when he's out here spouting off about bringing honor back to the Anderson family. Says that when Arn was just learning how to crawl in a pair of diapers, Ole was getting it done in the ring. And until one of them is left on their back, unable to stand up, the issue between Dusty and Ole will never be over. It will never be over. And as for Ric Flair, he still doesn't know how to get funky like a monkey. And he lets everyone know that sometime, in some universe, in a galaxy far, far away, Nikita is going to, quote, bust Flair's butt. And I was convinced in watching this promo that Nikita was desperately trying to hold back from laughing because the facials he made here were too much. Showed grave signs of restrainment. And after that, he mentioned something about Jim Crockett, and I kind of blanked out. I did take the time to note Dusty's references to outer space, though. I still vaguely remember the promo he did a while back where he was talking about space traveling with Ole to try and settle their beef on a different planet or a different galaxy. Now that I know Dusty has an obsession with space travel, this promo made a lot more sense in context. Only Dusty could pull off a nonsensical promo like that. Same goes when he's talking about getting down like a funky monkey. We all still remember it to this day, too. Speaking of funky like a monkey, Barry Windham got down with Tony Zane here. I now realize how that sounds in context, so I'm going to retract that statement and try to keep it PG. Barry Windham wrestled Tony Zane. Tony's man tits were now more bulbous than ever before. I think the purple welt above the right nipple kind of made that stand out. Barry had a hell of a time trying to give the guy hip tosses, but he still managed to get the big guy up and over. And I guess just to prove that he could actually get this big lunker up for some power moves, he also hit Tony with an atomic drop, followed by a vertical suplex, followed by a gut-wrench slam right before they cut the commercial. And yes, they actually went to a commercial for this TV match. Only for them to come back from break, and about a minute later, Barry just hit Tony with a lariat off the ropes and pinned him. And that was followed with Barry going over to the booth and acknowledging that he forgot that he had interview time. Always a fine way to start your promo. And all he did was talk about how he's coming after Ric Flair for the World Heavyweight Championship. That was literally it. I mean, to be fair, he did say that he forgot this was his interview time, so I wasn't exactly expecting him to have a list of material to talk about here. He was also still kind of blown up from the match, so his huffing and puffing kind of overshadowed the promo anyway. Then we came back from break for a quick Road Warrior squash, and it went by so fast I didn't even bother to write the job guy's name down. Whoever the job guy in red was that got dropped directly on his arm from a gut-wrench position, that did not look fun. And then about 2 seconds later, Animal hit the ring and killed him with a lariat where he landed right on the back of his neck. Wonder if that guy ever wrestled a match again in his life. And that took us to the booth for a Brad Armstrong public service announcement. That's what I wrote down. I can't even really call it a promo. He came out to put over how great 1986 has been for Crockett Promotions. Told everybody to have a safe and happy holiday season. Said that 87 was going to be a new year and a fresh year for Brad Armstrong to dominate and showcase his skill. And if there was a point to this promo, I could not figure it out. He did call out Jimmy Garvin at the tail end, so maybe there was some plot development there. But beyond that, it was a totally pointless promo. And then we had the Road Warriors back out. Animal here sporting his Spider-Man-inspired face paint, which did look pretty badass, got to admit. And Animal took a sec to call out the Four Horsemen and promised that the Legion of Doom were coming after them. Called out the Midnights and said that they still have a few scaffold matches left on the touring cities to get through. And then Hawk talked about the self-pleasure he gets from beating people up and listening to their bodies crumble up. Says that he's sick to death of all these geeks coming out here and talking about being big and bad, only to get in the ring and come off like a bunch of scared little girls. And anybody that gets in their way, it'll be the last time they ever wrestle a match in their lives. Which may have actually been the case for those poor job guys that got annihilated a minute ago. And Paul Ellering said something too. I didn't write a whole lot down about it. Something about the LOD traveling to all the different cities and being sure to leave a mark that no one will forget. He also had a rolled up newspaper in his hand, and I couldn't read the ink for the life of me to try to figure out what he was reading, but maybe he just came out of the bathroom before this segment. Didn't have time to throw away the newspaper. In any case, Ivan and Crusher had a squash, and while the graphic on screen read Ivan and Crusher versus Bill Tab and Al Garrett, do not let your eyes deceive you. This Al Garrett fella was no Al Garrett. It was a ruse. It was, in fact, yes, you guessed it, our good old pal, Pat O'Brien. And the only reason I remembered this, beyond the fact that if you took one look at Pat O'Brien the first go around, it's a face that you'll never forget. But the other reason I remembered it is that he was wearing the exact same ring gear he was last week. But I guess he was so ashamed of his poor performance last time that he tried to change his ring name, figuring nobody would notice. Now, unfortunately, O'Brien wasn't as present in this match as he was last week's match with Bull and Rude. Bill Tab took the brunt of the beating here. And quite frankly, if I were Pat O'Brien in that situation, I probably would have stayed on the apron for as long as I could too. The match was incredibly boring. Ivan and Crusher worked over Tab for what seemingly felt like 50 years. The studio crowd was actively behind Crusher and Ivan the whole time, which was high comedy. And at the point O'Brien finally tagged into the match, there was one studio member that screamed, "Break his nose!" So obviously he remembered what happened last time. See? What did I say? Whether it was Pat O'Brien or Al Garrett, these people couldn't be fooled. They knew it was the same dweeb. That's just hilarious to me. Like, in one taping, the guy changes his name, but he wears the exact same ring gear. Like, what was he thinking? Did he just think people would be totally oblivious to it? Not after the brutal assault that he endured last week. I also popped for the one guy that randomly shouted, "This ain't St. Patty's Day, moron." Because O'Brien was wearing hideous white and green ring gear with a giant clover leaf on the ass. I laughed so hard. And after the fans were passionately chanting for the heel Russians to kill this poor idiot, including chants of, "We want the sickle," well, guess what the heels did? Well, Ivan gave O'Brien the Russian sickle and the people popped for the pin. Great heel work. Giving the fans exactly what they wanted in the end. So, what do we have next? I think it was a Ric Flair promo, right? I asked that as if you all watched the show with me, and I'm using you as a reference. But yeah, it looks like that's what I have written down next. My notes got a little jumbled on this recap. Like I said, there's a lot going on. This is actually a great heel promo because I think for the first time and maybe the only time in Ric Flair's entire career, he actually gave everybody a clear foundation for how he was going to conduct his own interview. He said that for the first part, he was going to try and be very low-key and calm to conduct himself professionally while he talks about what Nikita and Dusty said about him earlier on. And then by the time it was over, he was going to blow up and be the Ric Flair that we've all come to know and love by now. Legitimately, he basically said that. And of course, he's running down his couple of matches with Nikita and Philly in Baltimore. And it started exactly as Flair promised. He was very calm, cool, and collected, mentioning how Nikita came out and vowed earlier on that Flair's days as world champion were numbered. And I think it was at the point where Flair started comparing Nikita to all the girls in the Marriott in room 806, where he totally went off the rails in a hurry. He mentioned something about the Horsemen being all in ready position. Something about how the girls are screaming and hollering while JJ turned off the lights to set the mood. And right when they all screamed, "Stop," that was where Flair drew the analogy to wrestling Nikita in both cities. So yes, in fact, for the record, Ric Flair compared wrestling Nikita Koloff to erotic foreplay. Okay, let me write that one down. I think I may need to remember that for future dates. That one may come back to haunt me down the road. Yeah, that was the entirety of the promo. He also asked if Dusty Rhodes would rather wake up in bed with Willie Nelson or Deborah Shelton. God, these 80s references are just a little too before my time. I mean, as a musician, I at least knew who Willie Nelson was, and I'm not really sure what the obscure reference was supposed to mean, but if in fact Dusty would have contemplated sleeping with Willie Nelson at one point in his life, I think there's a conversation that needs to be had there. He also at some point called Dusty a turkey and referred to him as a Boston Celtics fan, as well as throwing in a few other basketball references. I heard the names Larry Bird and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar mentioned. I'm not a basketball fan, if you already couldn't tell. So yeah, that promo was all over the map. For the most part, I had no clue what the fuck he was talking about. I had no idea how he was able to tie all of that together in the end. But leave it to Ric Flair to somehow draw comparisons between wrestling Nikita Koloff and having one-night stands. Only Ric Flair could do that. So after that, the Raging Bull and Rick Rude wrestled the Mulkey brothers. And Tony Schiavone, God love him, still trying to get over Mulkey Mania. One of the worst David Crockett lines of all time, because that was a reference that was never going to go away on television. This was slightly less entertaining for a Mulkey squash. Mostly that the bumps were a lot tamer than normal. R&R just worked over some body parts on both guys. And right at the end, Bull gave Randy Mulkey a sucker punch to the gut so Rude could set him up for the Rude Awakening DDT. I did take the time to write this down as a side note. The pant design choice for Rick Rude on this episode was mildly amusing. I can't tell if he was intentionally going for weird hipster designs or maybe he was just on LSD when he came up with the pants. Either way, it was a questionable pattern choice. They also did a Fiery Heat promo afterwards where they basically called out the entire babyface locker room. And it was at that point where I heard the names being dropped such as Rock and Roll Express, the Jayhawks, the Legion of Doom, and Garvin and Wyndham, where it hit me right then and there. Yeah, I was right. They legitimately had 0 established heel tag teams in the NWA at this point, aside from Bull and Rude and the Midnights. It was a good promo. I like Bull's line at the end where he said, "Riding the Bull ain't like riding Space Mountain, but it's still a good time." He also took a shot at Dusty, saying that anybody that tries to get in the ring with Bull and Rude is taking on risky business. You know, it's funny. We've heard a lot of Raging Bull promos in 1986. And earlier in the year, he was obviously a babyface still. But, like, I remember his promos were solid. Like, he could talk. I wouldn't say I was ever blown away by Bull's earlier babyface promos. It's like as soon as they turned him heel, I noticed a vast improvement in his material. Just one of those weird things where his babyface promos were very generic and bland, but it's like as soon as they flipped him heel, boom, miles better. Still kind of makes you wonder why they needed Paul Jones as a mouthpiece for this duo when out of the three men in the Paul Jones army at this point, the worst talker of the bunch was the manager. Funny how that works. Coming back from break, Tully Blanchard wrestled Randy Barber for the TV title. Incredibly boring, nothing happening match. Tully worked over Barber's left arm for about 5 minutes. The crowd got quieter and quieter as it went along. Slingshot suplex, 1, 2, 3. There's literally nothing else to say about it. Same goes for the follow-up Rock and Roll Express promo. Only thing I wrote down about it was that Ricky Morton came out in a denim jacket this time. It was a vast wardrobe improvement, even though I could still see the Mickey Mouse sweater underneath. I did like when Morton took jabs at the Awesome Twosome, aka Manny Fernandez and Rick Rude, referencing that a big dog left an awesome twosome in his front yard that same morning, and it was just as impressive as Manny and Rude calling themselves the Awesome Twosome on television. That was a good line. Even Gibson cracked a smile at that. After that, we had the Midnight Express back out for a promo, where we learned the following information. Jim Cornette, even at 50% when he's overcome with illness, can still cut a better promo than anybody in the business today when they're at 100%. He put over the Road Warriors as heinous acts that they committed to Cornette and his boys, but among the worst offenses wasn't throwing Cornette off the scaffolding, wasn't causing him to blow out his ACL on the landing, not even putting him in the hospital for weeks. The worst offense of all of it. Hawk and Animal made Mama Cornette cry. Aww. She even called him Jim Jim, which she only does when he's sick. But Corny and the Midnights are seeking revenge on the Road Warriors, not just for themselves, but for Mama Cornette. Because only the lowest of the low, the scum of the earth, would go out of their way to make a grown man's mama cry. So that was a 5-star promo. And in the main event, Wahoo McDaniel wrestled Paul Garner. I wrote down the following words. Match went forever. Almost fell asleep. Wahoo won with a chop elbow combo. Hideously boring match. And in the very final segment of the show, the Horsemen were all out for a promo, wherein Arn Anderson reiterated his talking point from earlier that he's naked without championship gold around his waist. He also stated that even though Nikita Koloff is the U.S. champion at the moment, which puts him at one rank underneath Flair for a future title shot, Arn is going to be more than happy to take away that meal ticket from him. Tully took a minute to establish the Horsemen as the best thing going in the business today. JJ kind of recapitulated the old catchphrase of, diamonds are forever, and so are the Horsemen. And Flair put over the genius mind of JJ for assembling the greatest group of athletes on the planet to create the 4 Horsemen. And they all did their big team huddle to round things out. It's the best version of the Horsemen. That original 86 incarnation. Doesn't get any better than that. So, yeah, that's kind of how they rounded things out. I know I kind of blew by a lot of the latter segments on the show, but these 90-minute programs really do a number on you, especially when the shows are mostly centered around the standard match, promo, repeat formula. I like the last few weeks where they had some big angles and featured main events taking place, just to kind of break up the flow a little bit. This one was kind of back to the status quo of a lot of the regular Saturday night shows on the Superstation. Not a bad show. Just a lot of monotonous repetition with the promos and squashes. But as we draw closer to the end of the year, We got one more episode from 1986 before we dovetail into the new year. And again, we got some big things to look forward to in the next coming months. Or the next several months, I should say. 1987. That is another good year for the NWA. It's still at the point where they're riding high. Business is doing well. They still got megastar after megastar on the roster. Big match after big match. So, got at least another couple peak years left before things kind of go off the rails in a hurry. But keep posted for the upcoming NWA reviews. Well, 'twas the night before Christmas when World Class aired their taping of wrestling on television. And I'm sure if people weren't praising the Lord at church, the family was all sitting at home checking out some pro wrestling before Christmas Day. Can't think of a better way to spend your Christmas Eve. And of course, this was back when wrestling was a family show anyway. Regardless, this is our second to last episode of World Class for the year 1983. It's hard to believe we've actually been doing this for well over a year now, and the World Class reviews are still going strong. Had a great time getting the opportunity to actually get to see a lot of the story progression in real time. A lot of it for the first time in my life. You know, I think I talked about this a little bit when we just started doing the World Class reviews last year. I had seen so many clips over the years, a lot of stuff that I would just kind of stream on YouTube. Obviously, I was familiar with a lot of the bigger angles and the bigger stories. I'd seen a lot of matches, but this is actually really kind of the first time where I'm going through the archives on Peacock and watching everything episode by episode and kind of dissecting everything in progress. It's been a lot of fun. You know, getting the chance to watch the shows week by week in real time and see what it was like watching old territorial wrestling from the early 80s like this really makes that nostalgia factor kick in. And there was a decent amount going on with this show. One of the matches in particular I'm looking forward to covering when we get there. So let's kind of dive into things and see what World Class dished out for a little holiday special. Beginning with them re-airing a previously recorded match from the November 24th taping. Kevin Von Erich versus Terry Gordy. And I vaguely remember talking about this match recently. Can't remember if it was the last week or the week before where we discussed it in detail. Not the least of which probably included me joking about it being the 853rd installment of a Freebird versus Von Erich match. I mean, we've seen just about every combination of all 6 guys in rotation for the last year. It is pretty great watching Terry Gordy work the more technical, fast-paced style with Kevin, though, and pulling it off to perfection, man. The guy was so damn versatile in his ring style, and it showed every time he was in there. You know, it's funny, we always talk about big man workers, and everybody tries to rank the big guys in terms of skill and agility. I don't think Terry Gordy's name gets brought up enough in that conversation. Like, I always talk about how talented Bam Bam Bigelow was, and he was a great big man for his day, but Terry Gordy, dude, truly an underrated man, especially amongst the great big men in the business. Now, seeing as how we've already talked about this match at length, I'm not going to go too deep into details again. Like I said, it was either last week or the week before where we just talked about this match, so go back and check out our World Class reviews and you'll find it there. It's all centered around Gordy trying to wear Kevin down so he could lock in the patented Oriental Spike, but Kevin was able to fend him off throughout the whole match to avoid having it put on him. And the finish was Kevin hitting Gordy with the crossbody off the top rope for the pin, followed by Buddy Roberts running down so they could try and do the 2-on-1 gang up. They eventually run off by David and Kerry, so that was put to a halt pretty fast. But they did manage to stomp on Kevin's hand and then hit him with the gimmick cowboy boot, so they were able to garner a little bit of their heat back. You know, and that's always the great thing about going back in the time machine and watching these Freebird Von Erich matches throughout 83. No matter how often they beat the Freebirds, because 90% of the time they did They were always going to be able to get their heat back in some kind of angle or post-match promo. Never mattered how many jobs they did. As long as the people got to see the Von Erichs beat the Freebirds up, they were always going to buy a ticket to see what happens. Makes you really yearn for the days when actual heat existed in the business. Not the artificially inflated heat where you get in today's business where everybody knows it's fake. But moving past that sad reality, they showed a quick little VTR highlight reel for David Von Erich on his ranch, which kind of ended up being another sad reality when I kept being unable to get past how quickly we're coming up on the tragedy in February. And again, it's one of those things where you look back and, try to review things historically, but it really changes the perspective of how you view things. Having all that historical context and knowing what ends up happening as a result of David's death in early 84, it really kind of sparked the beginning of the downfall of world class in a lot of ways. At least from its peak popularity in late 82 all the way through 83. Granted, business still did fairly well in 84, but things really took a turn for the worse shortly afterwards, and I think a lot of it can be traced back to February of 84. That was kind of the turning point in a lot of ways. We'll definitely get into particulars once we see everything unfold on television, but take note of where we are right now in the business as of December of 83 and doing these retro reviews, because the mood really changes in a couple months span. Not for the better. After that, we had Brian Adias and Kevin Von Erich with Bill Mercer at ringside. And in one of the most WWE-inspired interview questions I think I've heard from Bill Mercer yet, here's the exact question directed to both men. What are you doing here? He had all day to try and come up with captivating and riveting questions to ask the boys. And the best he could come up with is, what are you doing here? I have expected Kevin to give him a smart-ass answer like, trying to pick up a paycheck, Bill. Why else would I be here? What are you doing here? Now just picture one of the generic blonde interview girls with no personality asking the same question on Monday Night Raw. In any case, Adias said that he just got back from a successful tour in the Northwest, and Kevin's answer was literally something to the extent of, just figured I'd come down to watch the next match at ringside because why not? Apparently Kevin is scouting competition and trying to pick up tips or something to that extent. And apparently those tips were going to come at the expense of the following match. Doug Vines versus The Missing Link. Now, of course, I unfortunately remembered who The Missing Link was because I remember my Mid-South wrestling tapes from around the same time. And The Missing Link was also working that territory under Bill Watts during the same period. And that's about where the buck stops with me remembering anything the guy was ever involved with in that territory. Much like a lot of guys in Mid-South wrestling, people came and went very frequently. Watts was all about testing guys and seeing whether or not they would stick with the crowd. And The Missing Link, from what I recall, not really one of those dudes. The gimmick was that he was a wild, loose cannon type personality. I remember they gave him a monster run for a brief period, and nothing ever really came of it. He had a goofy-looking hairdo, which was perfect enough to scare the kids to bed for the night. He wrestled a very herky-jerky brawl style that looked kind of clunky and not very good. They wrestled for about a minute here before Bronco Lubick disqualified The Missing Link for choking Vines out with a cable cord. Which, yes, picture that in your mind for a minute. Bronco fucking Lubitsch trying to gain control of a wild, possessed lunatic. Comedy. And I think Bill Mercer kind of summed up everything there was to know about The Missing Link's run in the wrestling business. For what little impact he ended up having, he called him a strange apparition, and he followed that by saying the gene pool was apparently missing a few chromosomes in assembling the missing link. That is about the most accurate, politically correct statement that you can make about somebody. So that was obviously a Mid-South character that never really clicked with me. But you know who was a character in Mid-South that clicked with me? The Big Cat, Ernie Ladd. One of my all-time favorite guys from the Mid-South region to go back and watch. What a legend. All 6'9", 325 pounds of him. Obviously a former football athlete as well. I believe he played for the San Diego Chargers in the early to mid-60s, but don't quote me on that. My sports knowledge is about on par with my second-year calculus knowledge. But I know he was a former football star at one point. And if you actually take the time to read about Ernie's transition from football to pro wrestling, it is such a fascinating story to read. You know, the Cliff's Notes version of it is that by the time Ernie retired from pro football and made the jump to wrestling, like he already had bad knees. And I mean, you can even tell that going back and watching clips of him. He was very slow moving, even by the time he was wrestling in the 70s. And even so, he still wound up being one of the most successful heels in the business during that period. You know, the thing that was so great about Ernie was that he was kind of a revolutionary figure when it came to heels in the business around that point. Especially for that time in the South, a black wrestler portraying a loudmouth, dirty, trash-talking heel persona, that was always going to get a nuclear heat reaction. And Ernie would do every heel trick in the book to get the fans to hate him at every turn. Whether it was the Dynamite promo work or him walking out on matches or cheating, he really was kind of a perfect place, perfect time kind of bad guy. You know, I always enjoy going back and listening to some of those interviews, especially when he was openly bad-mouthing baby faces and using all the slander talk. Great, great stuff, man. You know, he's another guy the young heels in the business today should be aspiring to steal from, especially the ones that can actually talk, which are few and far between anyway. Now, of course, this was 83, so Ernie was already kind of winding down his career by this point anyway. I think he only had about 2 years or so left before he actually retired from in-ring competition. By this stage, his knees were totally shot. And, I mean, you could clearly see it watching this match with Kamala here. He could do very little. I mean, he only really left his feet a handful of times during the whole match. And the funny thing, too, I didn't even mention this. Ernie was a babyface in Dallas. It was another thing he was extremely flexible with. Being able to flip between face and heel and working both roles very well. They had a very standard back and forth big guy match. Admittedly, it was kind of painful watching Ernie visibly struggle in there. He gave Kamal and Skandar Akbar probably two of the worst looking big boots I've ever seen. Look worse than Kevin Nash. Literally all he did was stick his boot straight out and barely catch both guys in the side of the head before they took the bump. And even him raising his leg like 2 feet off the ground, it looked extremely agonizing for him. But the people went fucking nuts for it. It's crazy. But when you have that kind of level of star power, it doesn't matter how bad you are in the ring or how bad your knees are shot. You're over like God, dude. And it all ended with the heels double-teaming Ernie for the DQ finish, wherein Kamala laid Ernie out with a splash off the ropes and then kicked him out of the ring like a sack of dog shit. Poor Ernie Ladd. A rare appearance on world-class television, and they serve him up to Kamala like he's nothing. But hey, at least you got your territorial education for the week. So fast-forwarding to the main event, we had Johnny Mantell and Chris Adams versus Gorgeous Jimmy Garvin and Terry Gordy. Also, I believe our first time hearing the heels come out to Bad Street USA. Because if there's one thing we all remember Michael Hayes for, it was his quality musicianship. And even so, all joking aside, That song still slaps after all these years. And even with all 4 men set for competition in the TV main event, who gets the biggest pop of the bunch? Sunshine. Because we've now learned, added to the stipulation for the upcoming rematch between Garvin and Adams for the American Heavyweight Championship, if Garvin loses, Sunshine will get 5 minutes in the ring alone with Precious, which is what we all want to see, more than the actual title rematch. For a Dallas TV main event, pretty status quo. Brief babyface flurry of offense, heels cut off for the heat. Anytime Sunshine sneezed at ringside, the people creamed themselves. I will still never get over Bill Mercer's pronunciation of suplex. Gets me every time. And it ended up breaking down with all 4 guys. Gordy was able to put the spike on Mantell and then lay him out so the heels could try to gang up on Adams. And while Mantell was out selling, Kevin Von Erich ran down to check on him. And this finish is so baffling, yet so amazing at the same time. Factoring in that they've already done 2 straight matches on this show that ended in disqualification due to outside interference, they do an angle at the end where Gordy tries to punt Kevin in the side of the head while he's on the floor. Naturally, Kevin hits the ring to beat up Gordy to respond. And at that point, most common sense people would assume, all right then, so that would be the 3rd fucked finish in one episode. Well, as it turns out, Kevin and Gordy are in the ring tussling around. David Manning is standing there watching, trying to get in between them to separate them. And then while that's going on, Adams hits Garvin with a belly-to-back suplex, and then David Manning counts the 3 anyway. Now, of course, everybody pops for the finish, but it's like, so Kevin is allowed to just illegally run interference and David has no problem counting the pinfall? Like, I know there was kind of a built-in role on Dallas TV where if the Von Erichs are involved, it's all hands on deck, but come on now, blatant interference, and Manning's just like, yeah, whatever. As long as the heel's in the pinning predicament, fuck it. Who cares? So that was funny. As was watching Sunshine jump on Precious's back like a gorilla to try and yank at her hair before Garvin pulled her out of the ring. I also loved her post-match promo where before they closed out, they're trying to hype up her potentially getting 5 minutes in the ring with Precious, and she just goes, all it takes is 2 minutes to scratch her eyes out. Perfect go-home line. Couldn't have said it any better myself. Sunshine was a damn good promo. Never forget that. And it was a hot close. Almost made up for the rest of the program, which really wasn't all that great, if I'm being honest. But there were some interesting things of note. Ernie Ladd's sighting was fun to go back and talk about. You know, cross-referencing some things with Mid-South made me actually want to go back and rewatch all those archives again. I wish I had the time of day. Even a Christmas break won't give me enough time to dive into that whole library again. But hey, never say never. Maybe the Mid-South tapes are something we would consider for the FSWR channel down the road. Again, all we have to do is wait for me to get sick of ranting about how much SmackDown fucking sucks. In any case, got one more episode of Dallas TV to talk about for 83. We will be transitioning into the new year. We'll see how things pivot for World Class over the next 12 or so months. There's a lot that happens in 1984, historically speaking. So, guess that'll do it for this one. Stay posted for the Monday special. Get a big show coming up there in a few days, and the prep time will take a little while for me. But until then, I'd like to take this time to wish everybody a Merry Christmas and a safe holiday season, or whatever you celebrate this time of year, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, whatever. Catch you on the flip side, though. Thanks for stopping in. Take care.